Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Two Moralities, Conservatives, Liberals, and the Roots of Our Political Divide, by Ronnie Janoff-Bulman, narrated by Kim Niemi. Introduction. In the summer of 1789, during the early days of the French Revolution, the National Assembly of France met to write a new constitution. A particularly contentious issue was the question of the king's power. Should he have an absolute veto over acts of the assembly? The supporters of the king, who believed he should have such a veto, sat to the right of the assembly's president, and the anti-royalists, who thought he should not, sat to the left. Those on the right supported tradition and the status quo. Those on the left sought reform and change. The French newspapers used the seating divisions to describe the assembly's activities, and the left-right distinction took hold. This physical representation remains a powerful metaphor for the two sides of the political spectrum, liberals and conservatives. Yet today, a fitting image in the United States would include not only seats on the left and the right, but also a wide, seemingly unbridgeable chasm between them. We no longer have conversations, but instead hurl accusations across this divide. We do not discuss our differences. We demean each other's motives. Liberals and conservatives dwell in mirror image worlds of their own perceived virtue and the other's debasement. Left and right seem to inhabit different moral universes. I am a social psychologist, and my research in recent years has focused on morality, particularly the moral motives that underlie our everyday behavior. In the course of this work, I became interested in uncovering the moral motives associated with the political ideologies of the left and right. Morality, informed by moral psychology, provides an invaluable lens for perceiving the roots of political differences in the United States. Relying on a basic distinction in psychology, I argue that there are two natural forms of morality, and these respectively underlie political liberalism and conservatism. I believe that the currently dominant model linking morality and politics, described by Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics, 2012, misrepresents the moral basis of political differences. A new perspective is warranted, and is the substance of this book. I am asking you to take a step back and consider the possibility, amid our current poisonous politics, that the underlying motives of both liberalism and conservatism are moral and reflect genuine concern for our country. The left and right will always have strong policy disagreements, but constructive debate and negotiation are not possible when each side demonizes the other. We can either break as a nation or find a way to detoxify our politics. In writing this book, I am putting my faith in the latter course, or at least I'm not willing to give up yet. In claiming moral basis for political ideologies, I am not arguing that those who wield them, politicians or parties, are necessarily moral. Donald Trump and the Republicans who push his big lie certainly tell us otherwise. Ideologies can be weaponized for self-serving ends. Despite Trump's heated populist rhetoric, however, his signature accomplishments as president were traditional conservative fare: a tax cut that primarily benefited the wealthy, and the appointment of conservative judges to the courts. Why do certain positions resonate strongly on one side of the political spectrum? Why, for example, is the conservative agenda anti-abortion and in favor of the unfettered free market, whereas liberals favor a woman's right to choose and economic regulation? Do distinct moralities address different societal challenges? What are the psychological differences between liberals and conservatives, and how do they reflect the moralities of the left and right? Most generally, what moral psychologies underpin liberalism and conservatism? This book is an attempt to answer these questions. It is not a recipe for repairing the nation. Instead, my goal is to provide a new explanatory framework for understanding our political differences. The book is divided roughly in half and moves from a focus on moral psychology to a focus on politics and policy differences. In Part 1, Morality and Collective Concerns, I ask you to consider broad differences between liberals and conservatives through the lens of moral psychology. The primary focus is on the moral orientations that underlie the politics of left and right. I discuss their distinct moralities, the societal challenges they address, and personality differences between liberals and conservatives, as well as how perceptions of their own group versus outsiders inform charitable giving, immigration attitudes, and the rural-urban political landscape. These first 5 chapters are largely divorced from party politics, which I turn to in the second half of the book. In Part 2, Politics, Parties, and Policies, I focus on the potent disagreements that divide liberals and conservatives. I use the 2 moralities to unpack the policies of left and right and discuss why certain issues and positions are embraced on each side of the political spectrum, including guns, same-sex marriage, abortion, Obamacare, entitlements, and climate change. I also address 2 major threats to the nation, inequality and authoritarianism, and their relation to party politics and the 2 moralities. The country has always had left and right political divisions, but these days our polarization is particularly threatening. We need to lower the temperature rather than throw more fuel on the fire. From the beginning, my intent in writing this book was to be non-adversarial. This was relatively easy in the early chapters with their focus on moral psychology. It was more difficult when discussing specific policy positions. I have tried to support my claims with empirical findings from social psychology, political science, and other academic fields. I should also note that I found it impossible to be non-adversarial when discussing Trump and his Republican abettors in the late chapter on authoritarianism and anti-democratic forces. But I suspect that my judgment and credibility would have been seriously questioned had I pretended to be neutral on that subject. Today, our extreme polarization is evident in Washington, in the media, and even in our tendency to self-sort in deciding where to live. With our increasing distance, both physical and psychological, we seem more interested in justifying our contempt and anger than in finding common ground or understanding. This book may therefore seem like an exercise in wishful thinking. I prefer to think of it as a demonstration of trust in our shared commitment, if not to each other as political rivals, then to the nation and its ideals. We need to move past our rancor and enmity and consider our ideological differences in a less combative way. Recognizing the moral bases and collective concerns of both the left and the right can be a start. Part 1. Morality and Collective Concerns. 1. 2 Faces of Morality. What comes to mind when you think of a moral person? Someone who cares for a sick friend? A person who forfeits an advantage by choosing not to cheat? We are likely to agree that both are instances of morality. In our everyday interactions, we share an understanding of morality. Yet when it comes to politics, this shared understanding breaks down. Instead, each side of the political divide views the other as malevolent and irredeemable, as they embrace disparate policies that reflect distinct moralities. What are these moralities, and why do they diverge specifically in the realm of politics? Why do particular issues resonate so differently on different sides of the political spectrum? To answer these questions, we need to examine the nature and demonstrations of morality in our everyday moral appraisals. Caring for a sick friend and refraining from cheating are both moral, but they reflect distinct forms of morality that not only inform but underlie our political differences. The fundamental motivational distinction. Let us begin with the most fundamental distinction in human motivation: approach and avoidance. Whether we're meeting close friends or staying away from disagreeable coworkers, enjoying tasty meals or rejecting rotten food, listening to music by favorite composers or skipping pieces we find grating, we navigate our daily existence through approach and avoidance. Approach motivation moves us toward desirable ends, and avoidance motivation moves us away from undesirable outcomes. This distinction has deep roots in psychology. In Principles of Psychology, published in 1890, William James described pleasure as a tremendous reinforcer of behavior, and pain as a tremendous inhibitor. And these differences were echoed in learning theories based on rewards and punishments, as well as drive theories based on aversions and appetites. The central appraisal in approach and avoidance motivation is whether a potential outcome is positive or negative. Are we trying to attain something desirable, pleasurable, or beneficial? Or are we trying to avoid something undesirable, painful, or harmful? Typically, these differences in positive-negative valence are readily apparent, as in unexpectedly encountering a good friend versus a large snake. Here, the valence is recognizable in the object itself. Sometimes it is a function of a person's perceptions. Consider two different reactions to online dating. Sue looks forward to interacting with new people and is eager to engage with online dating sites. Ellen, in contrast, fears rejection and assiduously avoids these sites. In fact, psychologists have distinguished between a desire for affiliation and a fear of rejection, with the former emphasizing positive outcomes associated with social interactions and the latter emphasizing negative outcomes. A similar distinction has been made in the domain of academics, where some students have an achievement orientation focused on success, and others are motivated by a fear of failure. In consumer behavior, boycotts versus boycotts also exemplify approach-avoidance differences. Boycotts are efforts to purchase, approach a company's products to reward its good behavior, whereas boycotts are efforts to refrain from, avoid buying a company's goods as a form of protest. Work in neuroscience has supported approach-avoidance differences in the brain. Researchers have found lateralization of the prefrontal cortex based on this basic motivational distinction. Approach is associated with greater activity in the left prefrontal cortex, and avoidance is associated with greater activity in the right prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is located at the front of the brain and is generally related to executive functions such as planning, problem-solving, and decision-making. We all rely on approach and avoidance every day as we try to avoid unpleasant or dangerous outcomes and bring about pleasant and beneficial ones. These two motivations are essential for successful adaptation to our environment. As comparative psychologists have noted, all animals have approach and avoidance mechanisms, although they vary from rigid and simple to flexible and complex. At the most basic universal level, the approach mechanisms facilitate mating and getting food and shelter, whereas the withdrawal mechanisms facilitate huddling, defense, and flight to avoid danger. Both sets of behaviors are essential for survival. Two natural forms of morality. Approach and avoidance can also inform our understanding of morality. In my research, I have differentiated between two natural forms of morality that reflect these motivational differences and labeled them proscriptive and prescriptive. Proscriptive morality is avoidance-based and involves avoiding negative outcomes, specifically harm to others. It inhibits bad behaviors. Prescriptive morality is approach-based. It is focused on positive outcomes and activates good behaviors. The two types of morality are evident in the college student who refrains from cheating on a take-home exam, proscriptive, and one who shares personal class notes with a sick friend, prescriptive, or in parents' efforts to teach their toddlers not to take other children's toys, proscriptive, and to share their toys with playmates, prescriptive. These are different behaviors. Children can refrain from taking others' toys while still refusing to share their own. Proscriptive morality is about not harming, and prescriptive morality is about helping. They are not two sides of the same coin. Not harming is different from helping. Proscriptive and prescriptive moralities require very different efforts from us. Proscriptive morality begins with a temptation to behave immorally, perhaps to cheat, steal, or lie. To be moral is to refrain from these behaviors, to not do what we should not do. Prescriptive morality, in contrast, does not involve restraint of a negative motivation, a temptation, but instead requires initiating a positive motivation to engage in a moral behavior, to do what we should do. It requires activation rather than inhibition in an attempt to approach the good. Whereas temptation and desire are enemies of proscriptive moral regulation, the enemies of prescriptive morality are inertia and apathy. The General Confession of the Book of Common Prayer, dating to 1662, recognizes the two types of morality. We have left undone those things which we ought to have done, and we have done those things which we ought not to have done. The differences between shoulds and should nots typically manifest themselves in acts versus omissions. Yet we should recognize that the restraint that characterizes proscriptive morality can sometimes be evident in acts rather than their absence. Behaviors themselves can be constraining. Take speed limits, for example. Obey the speed limit, where the primary purpose is not to activate our foot on the gas pedal, but rather to constrain our temptation to speed. Similarly, the major motivation behind school uniform requirements is constraint, despite manifesting in behavior, donning clothes. In both cases, speed limits and school uniforms, the goal is to place strict limits on the expression of personal behavior. Inaction is not possible. The car on the highway must move, and the student in the school must wear clothes. Proscriptive morality is fundamentally constraining, whereas prescriptive morality requires the activation of a positive motivation and is fundamentally enabling. Research with very young children has shown that these two types of self-regulation, activation and inhibition, do not develop in parallel. Grażyna Kochańska and colleagues studied young children's willingness to comply with their mother's requests in a laboratory setting. There were two types of request. Each mother asked her child to pick up toys and return them to baskets, and, in a second room, to refrain from playing with attractive toys that were easily accessible. In other words, there was a should request, toy cleanup, that required activation, and a should not request, toy prohibition, that required inhibition. The children, studied from the ages of 14 months to 45 months, complied far more with the should not request than with the should request, and compliance with one type of request did not predict compliance with the other. The activation task posed a greater regulatory challenge to young children. Kohinska and her colleagues concluded that their data provide impressive evidence of substantial differences between the two types of self-regulation. Suppress selfishness and activate altruism. Diverse areas of psychology, from research with very young infants to studies of people's evaluation of others, strongly support the centrality and significance of morality in human interactions. Using both natural and experimentally created groups, social psychologists have found that morality is the most important attribute in our judgments of other people and our evaluations of groups. In spite of popular mantras touting individualism, we are deeply social animals. There are survival advantages to living in groups, and by smoothing our interactions, morality plays a crucial role in facilitating group living. If you wanted to devise a set of principles to help ensure that group members get along, you would likely come up with some version of these two tenets. Don't over-benefit yourself, which directly or indirectly harms others, and do be concerned about the welfare of other group members. In other words, don't lie, cheat, or hurt others to get ahead at their expense, and do your best to help other members of your group. In essence, these are the two forms of morality, proscriptive and prescriptive. One suppresses selfishness, and the other activates altruism. In recent years, our perception of human morality has changed from recognizing only selfishness and hyper-egoism to a more positive perception that acknowledges altruism as a fundamental side of human nature. For years, psychology accepted evolutionary psychologists' reductionist view of humans competing for individual survival with little inherent morality. Economist's self-interested actor, Homo economicus, is also consistent with this perspective. Early evolutionary accounts of altruism focused on kin selection, whereby individuals will incur a cost to themselves only to help others who share their genes. Hence, altruism was selfishness in disguise. This evolutionary explanation could not account for altruism toward non-kin, leading theorists to the idea of reciprocal altruism, whereby we help others because we expect they will help us in the future. This might work in small groups with direct interactions among members, but reciprocal altruism cannot account for altruistic behavior in large groups in which people don't directly interact. So yet another theory was proposed, indirect reciprocity, or signaling theory, which emphasizes reputation. Here, the good reputation that would follow from altruistic behavior would presumably produce in-kind behavior from others. This was not sufficient either. As Ernst Fehr and Simon Gachter write, unlike other creatures, people frequently cooperate with genetically unrelated strangers, often in large groups with people they will never meet again, and when reproductive gains are small or absent. These patterns of cooperation cannot be explained with the evolutionary theory of kin selection and the selfish motives associated with signaling theory or the theory of reciprocal altruism. A number of scientists, including E.O. Wilson, have turned to group selection to solve the puzzle of human altruism. From this perspective, we are the evolutionary products of multi-level selection, with selfishness shaped by individual selection based in within-group competition, and altruism shaped by competition between groups. Whether or not group selection accounts for our altruism, it is nevertheless the case that we are not only self-interested, but altruistic as well, sometimes putting others' interests above our own at a personal cost of time, effort, or resources. We have the makings of both saints and sinners. Franz de Waal calls us bipolar apes because of our capacity for great kindness and great cruelty. Culture works to reinforce the former and minimize the latter. We are motivated to act selfishly for our own benefit, but also altruistically for the benefit of others, and the rules and norms of group living encourage us to constrain our selfishness and activate our better angels. Recent work with infants demonstrates our very early sensitivity to helping and harming, suggesting that some rudimentary moral understanding may be innate. Researchers have studied infant reactions to helping and harming using a paradigm with 3 puppets: a protagonist, a helper, and a hinderer. The protagonist puppet tries but fails to reach a goal such as opening a box, climbing a hill, or retrieving a ball. The helper puppet facilitates the protagonist's goal, and the hinderer puppet prevents it. In the hill climbing case, for example, Kylie Hamlin, Karen Wynn, and Paul Bloom presented 6-month-old infants with scenes involving 3 googly-eyed geometric shapes. The googly-eyed circle tries to go up a hill but can't make it on its own. Soon, a googly-eyed helping triangle comes from below and appears to push the circle to the top. In a second sequence, the circle once again tries and fails to get to the top of the hill. This time, a hindering googly-eyed square comes from the top of the hill and appears to push the circle down to the bottom. The infants in the study watched these 2 sequences several times and were then shown a tray with 2 toys that resembled the googly-eyed triangle and the googly-eyed square. Which did they reach for? Without exception, the 6-month-old infants chose the triangle. Before they could walk or talk, they showed a clear preference for the helper. We are apparently born with an elementary sensitivity to helping and not harming others. From birth, infants react to other babies crying, and at 1 year they try to calm distressed others by touching them or giving them a toy. Children readily engage in spontaneous pro-social behaviors. As Michael Tomasello and Amrisha Vaish conclude, findings on infants and toddlers' instrumental helping, informative pointing, concern, comforting, and selective helping of harmed and/or cooperative others demonstrate that from early on, children are tuned to others' needs and emotional states and are motivated to act pro-socially toward them. Moreover, this research shows that children's early pro-sociality is the real thing, in that it is intrinsically motivated based in concern for others. Prescriptive morality provides benefits to others by engaging our altruism and concern for others. Proscriptive morality protects others by restricting our selfishness and self-advantaging behaviors. Again, not harming is not the same as helping. Avoiding the bad is distinct from approaching the good. Together, proscriptive and prescriptive moral regulation facilitate group living and maximize the well-being of human societies. Different attributes for different moralities. There appear to be times when the same behaviors can be framed as both proscriptions and prescriptions, but a closer look suggests otherwise. For example, do not lie and tell the truth seem identical, but they differ. A requirement to tell the truth is not the same as the requirement to not lie, because not lying includes not saying anything. This is evident in a court of law where defendants are legally barred from lying, but have the right to remain silent rather than provide truthful, presumably incriminating, information. In our research, my students and I have found that prescriptive and proscriptive morality differ in a number of ways.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?